Well, even the computer is trembling today. Well, this is a horrible story. It is a horrible story. And yet, this horrible story is a story of hope. Somehow, this horrible story is a story of hope. It is a story of darkness and death, mobs and mockery. It is a story of injustice, failure, and forsakenness. And yet, we have this thing as a symbol of hope. Hope. Of course, it is meant to be the opposite. It is meant to be a symbol of despair. It was used by the Romans and others to say, you have no hope. You can dream of no better life. You can't change your current circumstances. You can't revolutionize any brokenness in a system. The cross usually says, if you try and change, if you try and transform for the good, this is where you end up. It is a big, ugly, disgusting symbol to say, you cannot change a thing even if your life is miserable. You have no hope, is what it is meant to say. Hope looks to the future and sees goodness, that the future is good. The cross is meant to say you don't even have a future. Crucifixion screams hopelessness. There is no hope. And yet, Jesus allows himself to be taken there. He seems to see the opposite to everyone else. He sees the cross with eyes of hope through to the other side. And the incredible thing of what he sees on the other side of the cross is you. Jesus sees on the other side of the cross you. He sees the best version of you. He sees you as you are meant to be, the fullest version of you, the strong, the warm, generous, creative, virtuous you. He sees that for you. And so when everyone wants to run away from a cross, he willingly gives himself up on one because there is something that only he can do, and he does it with hope for you. We all live in a system. We have friends, family, neighbours, people we work with. There are systems involved with all of these things. Maybe there is a place that we go to work at. We all sleep and eat somewhere. You might have a microwave and a front door. Maybe you have a wardrobe, or maybe you have a floordrobe. I don't know. Perhaps you have a superannuation that's sitting somewhere being invested in an economic system. There's a system with our finances. Maybe it's growing, maybe not. We live in a political system with a looming election or two. There is an internet system that we exist with. You have an online version of you. And that whole way of life, including the microwave and the floordrobe, is very resistant to change. It is the way it is for a whole lot of reasons. In many ways, the system we live in is stuck. I'm resistant to change. I'm very resistant to change. I hate moving house, for one. I have lots of habits and routines that work with the house that I live in. So moving house means finding a new spot for the microwave and everything else, and changing mailing address, and where is the new servo for emergency milk at 6 a.m. But I go through that difficult process of change because there is hope on the other side. I'm going to something, and there is something to be left behind as well. There is something to be left behind. Now, this is a trivial example, but hopefully you see the point. One of the things about moving to a newer house when you've been living in an older house is that in a newer house, there are more PowerPoints around the place. Like each room has a whole lot of PowerPoints appropriately placed around each of the rooms. And when you don't have many PowerPoints in an older house, then you develop this coping mechanism which is called extension leads and power boards. And so we're in this older house, and just over time, like we didn't even notice it was happening. Just over time, we're just putting an extension lead there and a power board there, and that needs to get plugged in. Oh, we need a lamp here, so we need something for that. And when we moved into the newer house and we'd set up and we'd plugged everything in, we ended up with this huge bundle of extension leads and power cords, and we had no idea that we'd accumulated this tangled mess of coping mechanisms. We could only see what we were leaving behind once we'd gone through the other side and found a new way of living, this amazing way of living with PowerPoint. Now, it's somewhat funny. It's a trivial example, but it's also an illustration of bigger things in our life that extends to every aspect of our life. We have a tangle of coping mechanisms to deal with our not quite right lives. The pandemic has pointed out some of our coping mechanisms, some of how we're not quite right. Maybe we're more aware of the tangle of cords. Maybe we have new cords. Maybe there's new brokenness. And that extends from individuals to communities to nations, all of the micro systems and the macro systems. There's a way of functioning as humans that causes problems. It traps us in a cycle of not quite right. And our hope for the future shrinks because the cost of change is too high. So friends, there is a hard reality to hope. Hope for a brighter future means that some things from now need to be extinguished. Some things need to have the lights turned off on them. Habits and rhythms must end before new ones take their place. You might remember that Jesus talked about a kernel of wheat needing to fall to the ground and dying in the ground before an abundant new life can begin. We are very uncomfortable with this. I am uncomfortable with this. This aspect of hope is something we don't like to talk about. There is a dark and difficult side to hope. Hope is not just positive thinking. It is not just wishful thinking. Sometimes when we use the word hope, we mean just maybe, hopefully. We would like something to happen, but it probably won't. But when Christians speak about hope, we mean that we have an expectation that will be fulfilled. A child might wish to get a toy fire truck for their birthday, but if their father says, you are getting a toy fire truck for your birthday, they wait and hope for it with certainty. There is a huge difference. And Christian hope is more like the Father telling the Son that you are getting something. It is coming, and you simply have to wait and long for it. And when you face some of these hard realities of hope, the things that need to be extinguished, then you can live with a hard hope, a firm hope, something solid and unshakable. Over the last few weeks here at Oaktree, we've been listening to the teachings of Jesus to love our enemies, to have fruitful, hope-filled lives, to be careful not to fall into the trap of putting on a show, to be careful not to be empty on the inside. And Jesus compares someone building a house on sand with someone building a house on rock. When the rain came down, the streams rose and the winds blew and beat against those houses. One falls with a great crash and the other remains standing. Jesus sees a solid, hope-filled life for you. He sees a life for you that can withstand the terrible storms, that can withstand social and political turmoil, that can withstand relational and personal turmoil. A strong life built on a firm foundation. Jesus sees that for you, but he also knows it costs something. There is a price on change. Transformation is expensive. There is a debt incurred on the hopeless living, and the interest payments are too high for us. We have all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, and we're locked into the system. And there's a cross at every corner saying, you can't change. So what does Jesus do? He pays the price of transformation for you. The cost is death, but he sees the other side. Good Friday is good news because his death extinguishes the power and grip of the old way. We heard at the end of that immersive reading of the crucifixion that when Jesus had cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit, and that's where we ended. But here's the very next line. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The curtain of the temple represents part of how we are stuck in the old way. We are forbidden from living a heavenly life here on earth with God. But the effect of Jesus' death is that the temple curtain is torn open. We have permission to walk into God's all-embracing love. We have permission to freely receive the heavenly life. We have access to eternal and solid and unchanging hope. There is a better life waiting for you on the other side of the cross. And you don't have to pay the ultimate price because Jesus paid it for you. It is a gift. We call it grace. We call it amazing grace. So I'm going to invite you to stand, and we're going to sing about this amazing grace. And maybe you want to spend this time receiving that in your heart. We've heard the story. We've been immersed in the story. Spend this time opening your heart to God, receiving his forgiveness, receiving his grace.